Hello, everyone. Yeah. Welcome. We have a family crowd tonight, right? So keep this a little casual. Welcome to tonight's event for Hurricane by Salvador Gómez-Colón. I'm Omar Acevedo, and thank you so much for coming here to the Mark Twain House. If you're not a member, I know some of you aren't members, I encourage you to become a member. You can get discounted admissions to our author events and take a tour of the house when it's open. Salvador, was the house pretty cool?
It was pretty cool.
And it changes all the time. If you come back at Christmas, it's also set up for Christmas. And we'll have all sorts of tours. We have living history tours with actors. We have the regular tours. So please become a member and join the Mark Twain family. I usually make a script, and I remembered everything except for that. So I don't have my introduction for Salvador, but since probably about 80 to 90% of the audience know who you are, I think it's okay, right? Or we could have your mom come up here and say a few things. So yeah, we'll just go ahead and get started, if that's okay.
Great.
Yeah. Tell us what the book is about for those in the audience that haven't read it.
Yeah, so thank you all for being here. Really appreciate those of you who are not family. Can you guys hear me well without the mic? I'll use the mic, I guess, for the recording.
For the recording.
I guess so. I would rather not have to use a mic, but I will. Thank you guys all for being here. I really appreciate it. Hurricane, My Story of Resilience is a middle grade memoir that I wrote after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico when I was 15 years old. It was in 2017 that Hurricane Maria struck. And right after the hurricane, it was a time of extreme blur, and there was a lot of confusion about what we were all facing, what I was going to do. And the first response about a week after the hurricane was to launch a humanitarian initiative, Light and Hope for Puerto Rico. So the book is the narration of that experience living through Hurricane Maria and organizing the first few humanitarian missions of Light and Hope for Puerto Rico. And then, well, the rest is not yet in a book.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When I read your book, of course, as a Puerto Rican, as a person with family who went through Hurricane Maria, I was very, very knowledgeable about what happened. Of course, I was here on the mainland when it happened, and so I felt very powerless to help the folks on the island. But reading your book, I just felt, well, first I felt scared, and just reading, it's very visceral. You really show that it's not only, we don't have power for our cell phones. It's very like we don't have the ability to wash our clothes, and what does that feel like? When you were there, did it? How were you feeling? Like kind of take us through like when you first were seeing your neighbors, your neighbors in your building, and then your neighbors outside of your building. Like what was going through your mind and heart when that was happening?
Yeah, so I'd say that the experience living through the hurricane was extraordinarily saddening. It was I don't like to use the word traumatizing, but it was definitely one of those things that those of us who lived it, it'll stick with us in our heads for the rest of our lives, because there's nothing quite like the feeling of not feeling safe in your own home. And when you're sitting in your house, even though I was surrounded by my mom and my grandparents who were staying with us seeking refuge, you hear the howling winds bouncing around the living room. You see the storm shutters clanking on the windows and some of them flying away. You feel the water trickling through and slowly flooding the spaces that you've walked on for ages. And having that happen it messes with your home, and it messes with your world in a very weird way. I remember when we first started seeing our neighbors, it was actually during the hurricane when we evacuated from our apartment and went downstairs to the lobby. And I mean, these were neighbors. Some of them were in their 80s. Some of them were, young couples in their 30s who had just had kids. And you'd hear the babies crying. You'd hear the dogs barking. And we were fortunate enough that, right, our building was safe. The structure itself was intact. But we'd see stuff flying through the windows, and that was a viscerally scary feeling. When we walked around after Hurricane Maria ended, the actual winds and the rain, went to the bakery right a block or so from my house. That's when we started seeing how everyone else was feeling. And it was a sense of gloom and despair that even if people were from the wealthier parts of the neighborhood and people, no matter what their background was, they were still frustrated, they were still scared, and no amount of money could save you from the fact that the whole island was without power and there was no access to critical health infrastructure. Supermarkets, if they had food there, all of it perished. So it was really a chaos for all of us. But I think seeing that and feeling how others felt was part of what motivated me to start Light and Hope, and part of what motivated me to tell the story so viscerally. I mean, this is a middle grade memoir. So the idea was to get young people familiar with what this could be like, to understand, hopefully that they don't actually have to go through a hurricane themselves, but they can understand what it would be like. But most importantly, what it's like to be resilient and what it's like to feel and experience that and yet overcome and go beyond that. Yeah. So most of the stories that I tell in the first part of the book and the experiences that I relate to are those stories of my neighbors and their experiences, and knowing that if we felt that way in our community, then there would be thousands of others around the island that felt the same.
Yeah. I when I was reading your book, I was thinking, I'm at an age where I'm like maybe transitioning into like getting older. I know I look young, and gracias a mami for this, but I was thinking, for a book that is that's a middle grade book, I was thinking, wow, there's some stuff in here that's like heavy, but then I had that thought for a second, but then I was like, but think of all the things we're going through, and we have been going through. And then I started projecting back, like, oh, I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and that was rough, that was traumatizing. And we didn't realize it until, or at least I didn't realize it in myself until later, when I was much older, and I was like, oh, I can't watch footage from the day or anything because it's too much. Anyways, I'm saying all this because it's really interesting how much we can handle at all ages, even as young people, even as 15 years old. But it's a whole nother level when you are thinking like, wow, this is horrible what we're going through, but I want to do something to help people. Where do you think, in the book you mention a lot of support that you got in that, and I'm sure still get in your life.
Well, you can look at the audience and
yeah,
you can see.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that was a big help for you to have your mom, to have all these different people that you can connect to help you to find start Light and Hope, and help people?
No, most definitely. I mean, I think the most important part of the story that always goes through, and I was just in Chelsea, Massachusetts last week, doing a bit of a speaking tour around Latino high schools around the Boston area, and part of the story that I told these young people, many of whose parents are actually undocumented, and they were facing their own struggles and pressures of that, was that in no story of success or story of resilience or story of inspiration is it everything or ever only about one person.
Yeah.
It's always about a story of others who support each other and who allow for those people to build what they build. Yeah. And for me, I mean, from the get-go, when I started feeling this way, frustrated with myself, and I told my mom, I was like, Mom, I feel like I want to do something. That being here is not enough, and that I felt frustrated and I had to have an outlet for my anxiety. Also, I was in 9th grade and like I had no school for 3 weeks. So I said, well, maybe I could probably do something productive with this time that I'm not in school. And I went to my mom with the idea. I said, Mom, I think there's a need for light and hope in the abstract. And then I realized that we actually needed light because there was 100% blackout across the island. And we had lost our sense of dignity. We had lost our sense of hope. We couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And when we when we first heard about the federal response, it was very encouraging. We said, oh, we're going to get something. And then we had an administration whose idea of disaster relief at the time, unfortunately, was throwing paper towels like they were basketballs. And the politics of it don't actually matter, I think, in this story.
Yeah.
But I think it's about character. And it was about how we felt as survivors of that experience in the face of apathy that we were seeing from parts of the states. But this story happens because of the empathy that others had. And the fact that when I told my mom, I said, Mom, I want to do something. She said, okay, well, if you start this, you have to take it to the end. And I said, well, drats. Okay, the pressure's on. The pressure's on first because I was trying to launch this mission of helping 1,000 families in a single town of Puerto Rico, doing so by raising $100,000, which is a crazy amount of money for me. But when I told my mom, I said, how much should I raise? Should I raise 50,000 or 100,000 or 10,000? She said, go big or go home. So I did that. And that's part of it. But the other part of the story is that I didn't want to disappoint her. I'm like, Mom, I gave you this idea that I think I'm going to do this, and I don't want to make her think that I'm a quitter or that I inspire others and give an idea of false hope, because I know what it was like to feel this false hope. So when I reached out, I mean, there was no cell signal at the time, but I reached out to a mom's friend who had done some humanitarian work in parts of Africa doing a connectivity and electricity infrastructure building, which is really just giving out solar lamps. And I was texting her on the text message, but we had very crappy signal, so it was like the green text bubbles. Took hours to get to Puerto Rico, and that was my first support person who then, when I decided to launch the initiative, she said, okay, since you have no internet, I can upload the text and upload the images for you and get all that inside. And she was the first person who said, yes, I'll support you. And got the message literally into the internet because we had no way of doing that. So throughout the story, I mean, there's so many people on whom we counted. Once we started buying the stuff, I remember I'd impersonate an older person. I'd get on the phone and right, because if a 15-year-old calls you and says, I want to make an order of $25,000 worth of solar lamps, like, you're not going to believe him. But I'd get like, hello, this is Salvador Gómez-Colón, and sometimes it worked, but a lot of times they'd be like, are you a minor? And I'd say, yes. And they'd say, can I speak to a parent? And then I'd put my mom on the phone. She's like, no, it's real. We have the bank account. Like my mom's friend who had a nonprofit, I couldn't get 501c3 sponsorship that quickly, so she was like a donor recipient account. They're like, the bank account exists. The money's real. But even then, when we got the lamps into the port, it was all backlogged, and there was I reached out, cold emailed a ton of I don't know, they're like commerce brokers who do all this stuff at the ports. And I was like, hey, I'm a 15-year-old. I have no money to pay you, but if you can help me get these lamps out of the port, that'd be really great. Yeah. And he responded, and he said, yes, I'll help you. And he turned a process that had been from waiting from October to late November to get the lamps that were already at the port. In a week, we got them out. We put them in a warehouse. Yeah. So people like that really made the difference in getting this stuff from idea to reality.
Yeah. I wish I knew you at the time because my uncle works at the port.
I could have given him a call.
Yeah. Rafael Acevedo. Next time you know.
We'll keep in mind.
Yeah. Just thinking about the when you place. It's funny because I feel like, how do they know that's your mom? You know.
They had no. They just kind of assume that if there's a parent around or an adult around, it must be my mom.
Yeah. So you would say that definitely being a young person was probably one of the biggest challenges in organizing the campaign, right?
No, I mean, surely it's no one, right? Evidently, some people take you seriously, even if you're 15, but most people aren't. And there's ageism if you're too old to do something, and that's a really big problem in our society. But there's also, I think, the problem of not giving young people a sense of belief that they can also do things.
Yeah.
And that they're capable and they're qualified of bringing people together and getting stuff going, which is why I decided to do this, which was to tell young people, yes, you can do it too.
Yeah, because I think people do, maybe there is a stereotype or something that when you're, oh, you don't know how the world works. You don't know, it's like you're young, you don't know. So, when you're in high school or college and you have something that you're passionate about, older people, and that could be someone in their 20s or someone in their 80s, might say, oh, yeah, but that's not how the world works, and it's kind of like, well, give this young person a chance to prove themselves, and if they are passionate about it, we need more of that, because as you get older, you do get jaded about things. How did the community respond to your efforts, and what did that teach you about the power of grassroots action?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I learned about my community, and I guess what they taught me, was that the very definition of community changed very rapidly, because once the crowdfunding campaign went live, I mean, one of the first contacts we got from abroad, from not Puerto Rico, was this solar lamp company based in Hong Kong saying, we want to donate 1,000 lamps to you.
Wow.
And I saw, well, if we're in Puerto Rico and I think that we have an issue getting our sense of our struggle out into the mainland, then the fact that we have a company based in Hong Kong who somehow found out about this and saying, we want to send you lamps, and they did. They sent us lamps within a month. That was really impressive, and said, okay, then there's a sense of community.
Yeah.
As we continued to raise money and funds started coming in all around from all across the world, from Europe, from the mainland U.S., I mean, that was a sense of understanding that we knew that we couldn't depend on donations from Puerto Rico, because all of us were facing similar struggles. So even if you went to say any of the big household names in Puerto Rico, or even the States, like the Goya family that does the canned beans, and asked them for support, they were even facing issues. So everyone was facing this, but there was a sense of global community that was really impressive. And I remember that when we had we were deciding, the team and I were deciding, okay, what hand crank washing machines do we want to use? The one that I found that I really liked was this Danish guy. He built this thing called the Gentle Washer. I think it's unfortunately defunct now, but it was a great product. It was a great product, really cool. I reached out to him, said, hey, I'm interested in buying your product. For a month, no response. Reached out to him again, hey, now I have $60,000 or whatever amount of money I had. Hey, I would like to buy your washing machine. No response. Third time, I'm like, hey, I would like your washing machine for the next 2 weeks because we're launching a mission. He responded within a few minutes and said, I'm sending you a few from a warehouse in Pennsylvania, and I bought plane tickets to be there in Puerto Rico for the distribution. And seeing that happen, we had a sense of community spanning Hong Kong, the United States, Denmark, and obviously Puerto Rico, because every distribution that we were doing was not just we'd go in there and say, we have all these lamps. It was, we reached out on Facebook Messenger to community leaders we'd identified. We reached out to people that worked at the Y, or people who worked at the Boys and Girls Clubs, and it was very, very engaged, and that's how we got all this together. So it was really inspiring to see everyone around the world really engaged with this project.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember being on in the outside and seeing so many people. Everyone just asking, "How's your family? How are people over there? What can I do?" And just the interest, and that was just touching. Because as much as it feels like Puerto Rico is forgotten. So and it was good to hear that people really cared about our land. What lessons do you think you learned from leadership and advocacy through that whole process? Now that it's been a few years.
It's been 8 years almost.
Yeah.
The first thing is that I feel older. This beard was not a thing until 2 years ago. And I remember that when I was in, I guess ninth grade was around the time, but when I first grew like a little mustache in like fifth grade, I hated it. And it was really mortifying. So I promised myself I'm never gonna have facial hair ever. And I'm like, I'm too young to have, And then my sophomore year of college, I remember leaving that winter and telling one of my friends asked me, "Oh, are you ever gonna grow your beard?" And I said, "No, I will never grow my beard." And then lo and behold, a month later, this thing started. So in first sense is that I feel like through this process I felt older. And in terms of actual leadership, though, what I said before is what I think is the mantra that nothing happens alone. The most important thing is engaging with people equally, engaging with them empathetically, engaging with them enthusiastically, showing them that you want to be there, that you understand them, and that you really want to work together as partners is the most important part. Because a lot of what was happening after Hurricane Maria was that a lot of enthusiastic aid organizations were there, and they were showing up, but they'd show up with a massive crate of aid supply, and then there was no way to distribute that to people. Or maybe that's not what people needed. And then you'd end up having piles of maybe a ton of water bottles in a place that had a life straw water tank that was filtering water for them. What they needed was food, and then the community, 15-minute drive away, didn't have water, but they had food. So there was definitely an importance of engaging with people in that sense. The advocacy part, I think, came after, because when I was doing Light and Hope, the humanitarian part of it, it was not really about advocacy. It was just about action. Mm-hmm. It was about seeing a need, addressing it, and getting that done. Yeah. I think the advocacy part came later and came as a result of understanding that the issues that Puerto Rico faced stemmed beyond a simple hurricane. It was not just that we had this thing we can't control that slammed into us. It was about more than that. It was structural issues. It was political issues. It was social and cultural issues, economic, for sure. That's what allowed such a crisis to exacerbate and occur in Puerto Rico. So the advocacy came later, but I think the lesson in leadership was that you can't do anything alone. Yeah. Now let's talk about Puerto Rican history. No, I'm just kidding.
I could talk about that for about 5 hours, so we're not going to get into that. But, it makes me think hurricanes are not going away. They're not diminishing. In fact, they're getting bigger. They're getting more frequent. Government is maybe a little chaotic right now. Maybe a little, they don't know what they're doing right now. What role do you think young people can and should play in disaster recovery and community resilience?
Well, I think the first thing is that young people definitely have a role to play in disaster recovery and community resilience. That is unquestionable. And I think that is something that I didn't necessarily feel when I started doing Light and Hope. I didn't feel that young people really had a role to play because I didn't really find an outlet where I could plug myself in. And that's why this starts, is because I see, okay, there is a need both in the community, but there's also a need for young people to get involved. So I remember when I started Light and Hope, I told my peers, and they immediately said, oh, we want to volunteer. So every Saturday when we do a mission, you'd have tons of, maybe 3 or 4 SUVs full of kids from my school would show up, and I mean, they wanted the community service hours, so I signed them, but they were there and they showed up and they felt more important. Every mission, it grew. The first one I had one friend. I think one friend came with me. The second one I had 3 friends, and then I think by the last one it was a group of like 40 kids from my school that showed up. Yeah. So people really cared, and they was the same people who'd come over and over and over again and became invested. So I think young people definitely have a role. Civil society, I mean, is the pillar of community engagement, especially in the time of crisis, like after a disaster. So you need to have very deep collaboration with government, not only at the national level, but at the local level. And a lot of what we were doing, it's not like we'd go in there incognito and kind of talk with a club or so and then just go in. We'd reach out to the mayor's office, and you'd have the mayors show up to the mission. You have the local town council show up to the mission. So it was definitely really exciting to see that level of collaboration. Not just because I was 15 and it was cool to see like all these officials come in with their like, blacked out cars and all their fanfare that they bring, but it was cool to see that they cared. So I think young people definitely have a role, not only in bringing together other young people into the initiative, but also I think filling the cracks of where you need that level of engagement from civil society. Yeah.
And I feel like young people are a part in the community. They're looking at things like, again, in a different way. they have different connections to the community than someone who maybe, you've been part of the community for decades, and you're just used to seeing things one way, and maybe you miss stuff because when I go into the Mark Twain house, I'm like, okay, it's a great house, but I see it a lot. So, but when I took Salvador in there, and just the excitement, it's like, oh, wow, this is a really cool place, actually. Yeah, I think it really helps to reposition the way that things are done. Is there anything? Do you feel like there's anything that you might have done a little differently in that journey that you had with Light and Hope?
The answer is yes. I think in most cases, you need to have a reflection and say, okay, there must be something that I must have done differently. I think that the first thing I'd say is that at first, when I was starting the initiative, I had very little patience. So I was kind of expecting everything to happen all at once. And I said, okay, we started raising money, then we have to start buying the lamps, then we have to get them here. And it was always, okay, next. And I had no time to breathe. So the first thing is that I think I felt that I put a lot of pressure on myself, and by extension to the other young people who were working with me, because Light and Hope, then again, was not just my own effort. It was other young people, friends of mine who were also involved. That pressure passes on to them, and then they say, oh my God, oof. Then they have either an expectation to feel that way, even though they might not, or they do, and the pressure rubs off on them, and I didn't want to do that. So that's the first thing, I think, is that you don't want to take it all on yourself. I didn't want to take it all on myself and expect that I had the responsibility to solve a crisis that 3 million people were facing. And that was, I think, an error that I made early on. And I think I paid the price for it. The second was a bit honestly of overconfidence. Because once you have a few initiatives under the belt and a few initiatives that happen, you expect everything to go off without a hitch. And I expected everything to go off without a hitch, and I was wrong. There were some places we got to that overzealous. We said, oh, we want to get to these many houses by this much time. We'd reach a quarter of them, and then I'd have to break the news to the people, say, I'm so sorry, we actually can't get here today. We'd have to come next week or something like that. And that was really frustrating and saddening to say, but also kind of you're going back on your word. And that was something that was really frustrating for me for that to happen. Third, I think the other thing was, once this is part of the advocacy part, when I was engaging with media, when I was engaging with other people, I think I was just like so excited and so confident that, frankly, I'd go into every engagement or any conversation and be like, I know exactly how this is going to go. And sometimes I'd screw up really bad, and I would forget what I wanted to say. I would say a word that I probably shouldn't have said, maybe criticize someone I should have done, or just been too tired, said too many said too many likes, things like that if you think in retrospect, they matter, but you don't really notice them in the moment. So I think those are probably the 3 biggest lessons that I derived from my experience.
Yeah. I remember in the book you mentioned, I think this was when you were starting out, you were going house to house, and in the first house you spent a lot of time.
I think I spent like 15 minutes.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, it's not that much time, but if you had, I think you had 100 houses.
It was like 150 houses we were supposed to reach. You don't have to do the math to know that you can't reach 150 houses 15 minutes per house in one day. You can't.
Yeah, and your mom was like...
And mom was right behind me, and she was like, Salva, you have to go.
Yeah. Which is hard, because when you go into, you want to help people, you want to, like, talk to them and hear what's going on, have a empathetic, and not just go, but, you also have to balance, right? It's a balance. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. What advice would you give to young people who want to make a difference in their communities but don't know where to start?
I think you just get started. I think the most important thing
There's a Mark Twain quote like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I have not read it, but maybe I should, especially since I'm here. I think the most important thing that we as young people need to do is feel that energy and just go for it. Because if I didn't have excellent people around me supporting me, saying, I believe in you since the beginning, and I still felt hesitant, I can't imagine what people who don't have those support systems feel, but whenever they have an idea. And for example, I was at that school in Chelsea last week, and I had a student who came up to me. She told me about how her parents are undocumented, and she really cares about her parents' economic condition because they can't find work or find enough work. And she said, no, but I do some translation work, and I help the parents in my community translate for them during PTA conferences. And I said, great, do you get paid for that? She's like, yeah, a little. I'm like, well, that matters, right? Even if you want to have some sweeping large-scale change into immigration stuff, you're doing something, and that can become something bigger. So I think the most important thing is you just get started, you have the idea, you find people who are willing to support you, and even if you can't find them at first, you will find them.
Yeah.
You will find them. And just insist. Keep on going, and then you will. So I think that's the most important part, is to get over that obstacle that just because you're too young doesn't mean, it means you can't do something. You just have to do it.
Yeah. I think generally, and this is for all ages, I think it just feels really overwhelming, right? Like when there's so much stuff happening in the world and you're like, where do I even get started? I feel like, I've had some conversation with friends where, I say like, well, we can't all be human rights lawyers,
Nope.
But we can all do our part. We all have a part in our community to do something, whatever your strength is. Some people are artists, some people are musicians. It doesn't always have to be, the law or, something like that. It could just be giving people light and hope in different ways. And like you said, just getting started, just try something small and then go from there. Yeah. I'm thinking what before we move into audience questions, what's the next? Didn't you tell me you wanted to be governor next?
I definitely did not say that. I definitely did not say that, Omar.
I'm teasing him because that's a question that you've gotten, politics.
No, definitely not right now.
But yeah, what's realistically what's on the horizon for you?
Well, I think realistically, either graduate school or law school at some point soon. But I think what matters most is that I think after so much engagement with Light and Hope for Puerto Rico, seeing that impact of grassroots work on the ground, being so engaged, there's really nothing as satisfying as that. And I remember when I first got to Yale and was obviously disconnected physically from all the communities that I'd worked in, it's so much harder because I go back home every so often, and I might drive to a place and visit people that I'd worked with, and it's fun, but it doesn't feel the same way. Or if I'm organizing, I remember after Hurricane Fiona, Gunnar, who's sitting over here in the front, actually came with one of my other friends to run a humanitarian mission after the hurricane in a few towns. And first of all, the buy-in. I mean, one of my friends said, I'm so down, I'm going to go. That meant a lot to me. Yeah. But that was an experience that planning all that from my dorm room felt very differently than planning it from Puerto Rico. So I think what's next is trying to find another avenue where I can continue engaging with causes that I care about, with people that I care about. And whatever that may be, we'll see what that is. But right now it's up in the air.
Yeah, and I think it's also, it's important to take some time for yourself. You've been doing this for a while.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I had sent out our TV interviews to family members and friends, and I had a friend who was like, "Wow, how is he so well spoken?" And I'm like, he's been doing this for like a while,
8 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you've had a lot of practice, and you have your whole life ahead of you, so it's okay to take a break. I think that's another part of being a community leader and a community activist. Sometimes you just have to step away for just a little bit, for yourself and your family, and just you can go back in the future whenever you're ready, right? I'm very excited to see what's gonna come for you in the next 10, 20 years, and I think that I'm very hopeful that it's gonna be something pretty cool.
Thank you, Omar.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Do we have any questions out in the audience? Any family stories? Any baby pictures? Any questions? or maybe like if you have your own stories about being part of the community, any stories about Hurricane Maria.
Not everybody at once, please. Anything that any of you wish that I had talked about that I didn't talk about enough?
Yeah.
We still have time. I'm seeing the hot clock up there, and we still have time. So, yes.
Along those lines, I'd be interested in telling you talking more about did you live in Puerto Rico all the time? You moved here. When did you come here? You're at Yale now. This kind of stuff. Your biography.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to do that. So, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and Hurricane Maria happened roughly 3 weeks after my 15th birthday. So that was right at the cusp of a few years after teenagerhood began. It was a funny time. It was a weird time. It was middle school. It was high school at the same time. And that was biographically, I think that was the most important part of actually when I started this, because teenagerhood is a time when we start to find ourselves in our communities, and this was definitely something that I cared about. And I was talking to a few of my friends a few days ago about, even before I started Light and Hope, I was always involved in the service organizations, and I hosted food drives and did soup kitchens and all that. I always found a lot of satisfaction and a lot of joy out of that type of stuff. So no, I came to Yale. I've been at Yale now 3 years, almost 4, when I graduate now in May. But it's been an amazing ride. Actually, Jackson, who's over here in the front, one of my friends, he was at my first book talk that I ever did, which was at the Yale bookstore in New Haven, and now he's here at this one, which might be my last one while I'm here at Yale, which is also very exciting. Good capstone. But I think being Puerto Rican is an interesting concept, especially when you're coming from the island, because I think for a long time I felt there was no distinction between being Puerto Rican and American. And I think that was concept. I had my American passport because all Puerto Ricans are American citizens, which is great. When I'd lose a tooth, I'd get a little dollar or something, or $10 or $20 if I lost a molar, and the tooth fairy would put it under my pillow. And experiences like that made me feel very much like it was the same thing. And I think Hurricane Maria was the first time that I started questioning what it was like to live in an American territory. The politics of that were interesting. So the very fact, actually, that in Puerto Rico, Americans can't vote, but Puerto Ricans, who are thereby American citizens, can't vote in presidential elections. But in November, I stood in a line for 3 hours in the New Haven City Hall and voted. It was an extraordinarily emotional experience for me, because I felt like I was voting for the 3 million people in Puerto Rico who can't vote, and for the 5 million across the territories who can't vote. So that was really impactful for me to be here at Yale, to engage also with the New Haven community that I've been engaged with for the past 4 years, and quite literally exercise rights that I otherwise would not be able to if I was home. It lends itself to very reflective experiences being here. Yes, sir.
If I understood correctly, you have geared your book to younger readers, middle school readers?
Correct, yes.
I'd be interested in knowing how you made that decision. And then also, you're obviously a very articulate adult person. What challenges did that pose for you as a writer? Was there kind of a gear that you had to find? What was that like?
I appreciate those questions. The first one about the decision to write this for young readers, the basics of it is actually that I didn't have much of a choice. Norton reached out to me, the publisher, Norton Young Readers, and said, we want to feature your story. We'd like to negotiate something to have your story as part of a book for young readers. So that was at the get-go set for me. But in terms of why I chose to go ahead with the project and say, this is something that I'd be interested in doing and not push, or maybe I want to change the age category or the target audience, I really would have wanted to have a story like this to be able to talk about and to hear, to know that young people were doing similar things or things that I aspired to do at that age. So I said, well, if I could have had not necessarily about me, but some other story of a young person. I think the person when I was young was Malala. she was the young person that every teacher talked about, that all of us had read her biography. That was the figure. And I felt that in Puerto Rico, a lot of us actually couldn't connect because we didn't understand that history. So I said, well, if we can write something that Latino youth, especially youth who are in climate vulnerable areas or who have disasters that they face, can understand part of a story and feel connected to, that was good. In terms of the writing process, I was a high school junior or senior. It was between junior and senior year. It was COVID summer 2020 when this project begins. And I remember my biggest gripe was that my editors kept on telling me, you are not writing for your professor, you are writing for middle grade readers. And I said, okay, let's rewrite and go back again, because I think I was very eager, which I guess is from the think of about advice and doing things differently. I think we have to breathe and pause a bit more. And I said, oh, but I want to articulate this and I want to articulate that. And I realized, no, you have to do this in a different way. So I actually went back to some books, my favorite books. I went back to Roald Dahl and to Matilda. I went back to the Magic Tree House series. And I said, okay, what are these books that I used to read and why did I enjoy reading them and how were they written? And that's kind of what inspired the process of how I wrote that. But it was definitely hard because I was, and you mentioned that I'm an adult person, which is, it's hard to understand, but yes, I am 22 now, so I am an adult person. But at the time, I wanted to feel like more of an adult. Now I'm kind of resisting it. And I think that was hard to shift that focus, but it was definitely valuable because I think that was the point of the book, is for young people to read it, not necessarily people my age at this point to read it. But I'm grateful if you do.
Yeah.
So question's interesting. How did you choose Yale? What was the reason you came to Yale?
It's a great question. I wrote a few essays about that actually to get in. I chose Yale because I visited Yale over the summer of 2019, before COVID, and I felt like it looked like Hogwarts. And I said, this place is so cool. And I remember going around the campus, and I at the time I actually wanted to be a doctor. So I thought the science buildings looked cool, even though I'd been to the ones at Harvard and MIT, and I was like, oh, they look really cool. But Yale somewhat felt more like a better place. The vibe was greater. The students felt much more engaging. They felt like they weren't as stuck up as other schools. No offense to any of the other schools, but it felt very genuine community, and it felt like a place where you obviously have very ambitious people. Anyone who applies to a place like Yale has desires and dreams of their own. But it felt like a place that was really collaborative, and that young people I spoke to, and even the other kids that I knew who were applying to Yale, had a certain sense of camaraderie that I didn't sense in any other places. So that was pretty important to me, and I think that also being in a place like New Haven is really important, because you're not in a massive city. You're also in a city where town and gown relations have historically not been the best, so you want to be a part of that, of making that better and improving that relationship. So I think that was a bit of the thought process that went into why I chose Yale.
Yeah, so you started writing this in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and then the hurricane happened 3 years before, and then 2 years later, Family comes out with
Mm-hmm.
what was like your connection with that, or how did that resonate for you in correlation to like 2 years into your project? What was that about?
Yeah, I think that the fact that you mentioned Bad Bunny is actually remarkable, because I remember when Bad Bunny was putting out songs on SoundCloud, and he was a supermarket bagger who used to do this at night, and now he is quite literally the biggest global sensation. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. I think he was like the #1 streamed artist on Spotify. He's been on covers of magazines. Which for us, for being Puerto Rican, it's a big deal.
My aunt was a teacher at his school.
That you see, everyone has their Bad Bunny story, and because Puerto Rico's small, so it's natural that we all have this feeling. I think for me, the fact that this Bad Bunny has elevated the specific issue of the power grid is really important, because it's an issue that you'd think in the United States, if you consider Puerto Rico, it's an American territory, the fact that we have weekly blackouts whereby 3 out of 10 households in any given day don't have power. It's abhorrent. It's ridiculous. And it doesn't happen anywhere else. And if you go on the website, at least a few months ago, if you went on the website of the Department of Energy that's tracking all the outages across the U.S., Puerto Rico is the only jurisdiction that does not show up I wonder why. And you see maybe small outages here or there, and he maybe says, oh, 50,000 households in the U.S. are without power, and then you count Puerto Rico, and boom, your proportions rise. So I think the fact that Bad Bunny put out a video and a song about this, and about also the cultural issues of people moving into Puerto Rico and housing displacement and all that, it really matters for Puerto Rico's story to be elevated to this point, and he's been doing a great job at elevating that. So it was important for me to see someone from Puerto Rico who was singing, right, trap music, putting it on SoundCloud, and then 6-7 years later, speaking and singing about these very deep themes. It was very impressive and exciting to see a Puerto Rican face on the cover of all these magazines.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, that doesn't always happen when someone reaches fame, right? It's, they become famous, and then, part of fame, you get distracted by other things, and then you forget. I'm not saying, people consciously forget about where they came from, but you just move on into a different stage in your life. Mm-hmm. But that's not what's happening with him. He's like, no, we're going to continue centering Puerto Rico and what's happening there. So, yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
When Hurricane Maria happened, I actually wanted to do some fundraising, get involved in fundraising efforts in Hartford, via nonprofits and groups and whatnot. And several years later, I went to the island to tour certain things I wanted to see and certain things I wanted to do. And I bumped into, or I connected with an artist, I'm not sure if you heard of him, Samuel Lynn, from He said the diaspora really helped out a lot. So I'm not sure if you could maybe talk about your experience. Could you talk about that at all? What kind of help that the diaspora that you saw versus, and also the help that the federal government, maybe you could talk a little bit about both sides and positives or negatives or things that we could learn in the future in case something like this ever happened again or another part of the world.
Of course, I'm happy to. I think the most important part to start with to that question in answering it is that the relationship between the Puerto Rican diaspora and the Puerto Ricans on the island has always been kind of fraught. And I think a lot of people will not like to accept that because the Puerto Ricans on the island like to think that they're super welcoming, and we are super welcoming, but there's definitely a bit of an issue when people with the diaspora come and people on the island might think that, oh, you're trying to appropriate my culture. What is my culture, right? What is our culture? And then on the other hand, people from the diaspora might get to Puerto Rico and feel that they aren't necessarily welcome because they've been uprooted from the culture and the community that they're used to. So I think the first thing is understanding that relationship has always not been the best, but it could be better. Light and Hope for Puerto Rico is definitely working with a lot of, not a lot, but a few Latino organizations, Puerto Rican organizations based in New York. That was where most of our support was focused because most Puerto Ricans in the States are in Puerto Rico, Florida, or Hartford, Boston, Massachusetts area. So we were definitely working with them, and it was really impactful to see people who were sharing. There were a ton of these groups that were sharing the crowdfunding pages on their Facebook pages and all that, and that was really inspiring because I know, and not only from your question, but from my conversations with people, that Puerto Ricans on the diaspora felt really scared and frustrated and also equally annoyed and humiliated by the experience that Puerto Rico is having with terms of the disaster response effort. And it's not in our place as island Puerto Ricans to tell a diaspora Puerto Rican, no, you don't have the right to feel this way. Of course you have the right to feel this way. It's also your Puerto Rico. So I think that's the first thing. In terms of the federal government's response, I was part of a project that FEMA, I mean, if FEMA exists, maybe next week, but at least it's in the archive somewhere. I was part of a project that FEMA was doing to interview dozens of people, ranging from Vice President Pence, Diane Criswell, who was the then FEMA administrator, the person who served as DHS secretary under the Trump administration, all the way down to community leaders like me, asking them about exactly this question: what went wrong, what went right? And the idea is that FEMA and the disaster recovery community acknowledges and they understand that there were many things that went wrong with Puerto Rico, and they are trying for that not to happen again. And I have to give them credit for that because I know we were very frustrated when that hurricane happened, but especially during the Biden administration, there were a lot of efforts to remedy all the processes and the stopgaps that made it so much harder to get the aid we needed. So I want to preface that with that question, or with that point. But back to your question, I think the frustration with the government was simply that we saw other hurricanes in other states, or I guess not in other states, in states, where the response was visibly so much faster, visibly so much more expensive. And it's hard not to feel somewhat isolated and felt forgotten. Because you hear, I mean, hurricane, I think Irma battered Florida and Houston, Texas, Houston area, and they were without power for like 2 weeks. 2 weeks after, power's back, which I'm glad that they got their power back. But then Puerto Rico, the last household that got power after Hurricane Maria was 11 months after the hurricane, which is a disgrace, frankly. But then you have to, you can't say that that is because of the super dedicated people who are working with FEMA, who are staying, up for days working on this, the people who are working in the electrical brigades, cleaning debris and putting up the poles. That's not their fault. It's not their fault. It's much more structural. But what I say is that I think I'm much more encouraged, at least when I was doing all those interviews in that process, that 2 years ago, a year ago, there were very serious efforts to prevent anything like this from happening again. And I hope that with this administration, we don't forget.
Yeah, yeah. And going to back to one of my favorite topics, which is the history of Puerto Rico, especially under the American government. It's a complicated issue, and there was a lot of things wrong with that particular administration when Hurricane Maria happened, but there were so many things before that under administrations of both parties, on the island and in the mainland U.S. So there's a lot of blame to go around across the political spectrum, and the people who suffered were the people of Puerto Rico, and then brothers and sisters here on the mainland, literally family members here on the mainland. So yeah, it's a very complicated issue that led to this very horrific situation, and Puerto Rico continues to struggle in different ways right now.
But we're resilient.
But always, yeah.
And I think that's what matters.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I see a young woman in the audience.
I have a question. What was your favorite place or person to visit that you cherish still 80 years later during your humanitarian work?
I think the premise of that question is someone not my mom. Although I mean I say this all the time in public and in private that I would not be here if it were not for her support, and I would not be anywhere if it wasn't for my mom always believing in me and telling me that I could do things. So that is clear. I think in terms of the most impactful stories, there's a few. There's one of this girl that I met in my first visit in Loíza, which was the first community that we reached. That she, when we get there, she was reading a book on her ledge or on her balcony, patio really. I mean, it was a wooden house. It was probably not more than 400 square feet. It was very small, but she was standing outside reading her book. And I realized she was kind of like my age, so I asked her, "Hey, what are you reading?" She's reading a book, and she said, "I'm reading it for school because I don't want to fall behind." And I asked her, when is your school starting again? She said, I don't know. And this was December of 2017. This was 3 months after the hurricane. And that broke my heart because I've always been an avid reader, as I mentioned, answering to your question, sir. I was seeking inspiration of other books when I wrote this one, and the fact that this girl was still determined to read, to not fall behind in school, was so inspiring because I saw, well, she literally doesn't have a roof right now, or part of her roof is one of those FEMA blue tarps that they were putting up, and she's reading. So when I gave her the lamp, I knew that meant that she could read at night, and that was really heartbreaking for me. And then there was another case a few communities later where there was an elderly woman she was bedridden, and she had been lighting her house with a kerosene lamp.
Oh yeah.
And the idea, the number of horrific things that can happen lighting a kerosene lamp nowadays anyways are many. But if you're in your 90s, you're bedridden, there's sheets and there's fabrics and all that everywhere. I mean, it was very scary. And to me, I mean, I took that kerosene lamp and I said, ma'am, I don't think you need this anymore. And we put it outside. Because now you have an LED solar lamp that you can charge during the day and use at night. And that mattered. So I think those stories of seeing young people and what this absence of light meant for them, but what a solar lamp could do for them, and also an elderly person whose life was literally at risk just to keep light on, were two stories that were particularly meaningful for me.
Awesome. Oh, one more question.
Just more a comment to say that coming here today and seeing you talk about what this was like for you being in high school kind of feels like full circle for me. When that happened, I was also teaching high school, and it was starting the school year, and so I remember I had a class of sophomores, and this one student, she was like glued to the radio. She brought this radio every day to school, and we would go as a class, we would go on a walk, and we would just be like glued to the radio, listening intently throughout that whole entire time. And so now hearing you just kind of feels like it's coming back.
Thank you for that.
On that note, we'll wrap up for this evening. Do you want to sign some books if people want to?
If they want to buy them, sure.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Make sure to buy the book. You can do that in the store. We also have a lot of cool stuff in there. And I just want to plug that we have the Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Award. And if you want to become a volunteer reader for the award, please contact me. I'm the only Omar Acevedo here. So you can go on the website and find my email. I don't have any cards, but you can find me. And it's a really cool process. We have, I think we're maybe up to 154, 155 books that you can choose from. Read at your own leisure from now until May. We only ask that you read 2 books. They're all fiction. But they're all different kinds of narratives, all different diverse voices and experiences. And yeah, just it'd be cool if you'd want to do that. And again, I just want to grow Mark Twain family. So Salvador is now part of the Mark Twain family.
Thank you for welcoming me. And thank you to all of you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.